Okay, so this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on The Statesman. I believe that this is part 6 in that series. I have a feeling that this one is going to be a long series. But anyway, the beginning of this might seem kind of abrupt because I stopped in the middle of a paragraph. The reason I did that was because the last episode was over 2 hours. Usually I like to keep them around 2 hours. And so it might be kind of strange to pick up here, but I'll do my best. So I went on a bit of a tangent on the ending of the last episode, so I'm kind of glad that we cut that off and we could begin this anew. So we are on the heels of a mythical narrative that was expressed by the visitor, one of the interlocutors in this dialogue, the other being young Socrates. Again, this is not young Socrates being the Socrates that we all know. This is a young Socrates as a namesake. It's a boy separate from the philosopher Socrates. So we're coming off of this myth. We're still talking about it, but we're nearing the end of it. That involves the age of Cronus and the age of Zeus. The age of Cronus involves a period where there is increased intimacy between divine order and the difference of that which is, that has grown in a productive manner into the cosmos, which would include us. So what that would mean is, in this period, people, although they may have reduced agency because they are more bound by divine order, it becomes more natural to them. And actually, now that I think about it, I understand where that tangent was going on the last episode. I got into this conversation about the implicit nature of understanding and how slippery it can be at times because it's something that can be given to delusion and falsehood, but it's also something that can provide us with correct information. But in the way that it's correct, when the human being, the humankind, experiences one of these periods for which the cosmos is now more divinely oriented. Now, what does that mean? Part of this has been to discover exactly what that means, but it means more that, from a human perspective, that the difficulties of survival are less, that there is a greater abundance, that it's not necessary to have ourselves strong, orderly institutions because our congregation is second nature, almost. It's like this harmonization with life. It's not until the age of Cronus ends when we experience this disorder and falsehood that then we are required to exert our independence, our agency, to exercise our reason, to establish strong institutions, to have laws, so that we don't rip ourselves into pieces. In fact, earlier, I'm not sure if I can find it, but earlier the visitor says something about preventing us from falling into like murder, cannibalism. I wish I could find exactly where that section was at. Here I believe it is. As for living things, divine spirits had divided them between themselves, like herdsmen, by kind, and by herd, each by himself providing independently for all the needs of those he tended, so that none of them was savage, nor did they eat each other. And there was no war or internal dissent at all. And as for all the other things that belonged as consequences to such an arrangement, there would be tens of thousands of them to report. So, in other words, this period of abundance, an ease of ontological expression. As we enter into Zeus, this is reversed in a way. It's not reversed entirely in terms of the negative, but there is a reversal in terms of the pendulum swinging more towards independent agency. The hand of the Father recedes, and the ease of ontological expression now is flipped. Now there is much work that needs to be done on the part of the individual. And before we get into the new material, I want to say that it has been work for us not to fall into the type of interpretation that is too antagonistic or too contrary. Because what we are trying to do is to build a better spiritual relationship with God, number one, but also understand what is being said on its merits. So if we immediately dismiss a story as being something that is untrue, we miss certain principles by which we may come to understand a more significant spiritual image, let's say, in our minds, that can be useful in all sorts of different facets of life. So it's with this spirit that we have to progress through this dialogue and all things on this podcast. Okay, so let me read the sentence that we left off with. So we're at the point where we're leaving the age of Cronus and entering the age of Zeus. He says, and everything else changed, imitating and following on the condition of the universe. And in particular, there was a change to the mode of conception, birth and rearing, which necessarily imitated and kept pace with the change to everything, for it was no longer possible for a living creature to grow within the earth under the agency of others putting it together. Okay, so the sentence doesn't end there, but this is where we were. And I think that there is a considerable amount that goes into this agency. And I've used ChatGPT to assist me in trying to understand this. Perhaps I'll use what it has said here, perhaps not. I read through this yesterday, and I think some of it was interesting, some of it's not. I try to use it as little as we can, but sometimes it's useful. So I'll read this part again. For it was no longer possible for a living creature to grow within the earth under the agency of others putting it together. Under the agency of others putting it together. Now, in the first instance, I had spent some time thinking about what it meant for having a living creature to grow within the earth. In the sense that this is physical, I think we would miss what he is trying to say. I would not be surprised, even in the visitor's day, to have read of an account where somebody has sprung from the earth. I would be surprised if one was to say with concrete certainty that in the physical sense, a person was born from the soil, that an infant suddenly cried out, reached his hand through the soil, and instead of the umbilical cord being attached to a human being, having it spread from the belly into the earth like roots on a tree. This I would find difficult to believe. But this is not the type of causation that we are looking for here. In fact, the type of causation that we are looking for is actually very subtle. The image of the child being born in the soil is actually useful. It's useful in the sense that of various relations. I think, as I talked about earlier with intuition, sometimes, many times, at least in my experience, it is difficult to intuitively know the various interconnected parts of, let's say, a system. This could be a car, this could be an economy, this could be a biological process, a biological being. It could be anything. It could be an instrument. And I think that there are certain people that are better than others at picking up these patterns more intuitively. Other people need to sort of go through a lot of repetition and a lot of reasoning to come to a conclusion that somebody had inferred rather easily. And there are scales to this. I happen to be a person that needs to go through things reasonably, and I'm very poor at the intuitive understanding of things. It's an unfortunate state of my mind, I think. I can intuit fairly well, I think, the emotions of others, which is useful in certain instances and perhaps not so much in others. But of course, this isn't about me, but the individual and how the individual relates to his or her environment is relevant. So insofar as this child is being nourished by the earth, what they are being given is body. The earth can be seen as body. It is sort of that base material that is fairly purposeless on its surface. It may be purposeful in its connection to other things that are, but by itself, or maybe I should say, by itself, the purposes that it fulfills are of a fairly simple nature. I don't mean in terms of all of the earth, but I think of the base material of the earth. Let's say we take a bit of iron, for example. In it, we can say that there are purposes. The atoms that are involved in the stability of that object, or the identity of iron, have a particular purpose to maintain itself and not to fall into some other identity, destroying its own identity. The forces of nature, the inclination of nature is such that the behavior is this way. Now, if we can imagine that purposes can be shared among things, I don't think it would take us very long to imagine if we take one seemingly separate identity from another, and we put them together. So let's say I want to take kind of a natural thing. Sometimes it's difficult to to grab just one because it's quite simple. We could take a blade of grass, for example, and we could say that of this blade of grass, it is a living organism, and it is also made up of simpler elements that each have their own identities. And so, on the basic front of iron, now we have a more complicated structure that has interrelated purposes, or strongly associated purposes. While at one level, independent identity exists, on another level there is shared identity, and so forth. It doesn't have to be life. It could be something, I think, even simpler. But this is, I think, sufficient. Because the point that I'm trying to make is that of the purposes that are shared, we've established something important. We've established at least a possibility of, as things relate to each other, instead of being just outlined and defined as being something that is unique and separate as an identity, these things can be tethered together. And it is within the tethering that I find our focus should be. This sort of transjective sort of experience. And in the human experience, this is sort of on steroids. Between our bodies and our relationships to others, these sorts of processes are very complex. And then we scale them to add multiples, and we scale them all the way up to the whole of our species. It's quite a remarkable thing to reflect on, despite being so small relative to everything else that is in this material reality that we are aware of. Focusing on the interrelatedness of purposes, and by extension, the shared purposes, we have established that of the simplest material elements of our reality, they have some purpose, although seemingly reduced when we consider that to the mind of the human being. We've also established that we can have quite simple things articulating with one another. That while although they occupy two different agencies or identities, they still, while participating with another, maintain their own. And so we have to scale this yet farther if we are to examine and establish the relatedness of anything to the divine, but then also understanding that of any sort of relationship to the divine, and to the age of Cronus and to the age of Zeus, of which we are now speaking. So in the age of Zeus, it was no longer possible for a living creature to grow within the earth. So what we see here, I think, is two things. One is the implication that much like dominoes, in the divine sense, one domino is knocked over, and the series of relatedness among things causes there to be a change. Now, this change is not as linear as the striking of dominoes, nor do I think it is as material. It is a purposeful change, just in the way that we have discussed that when the human being is no longer born of the earth, but rather born of a natural type of conception, it is not to say that human conception is really any different than it was in the age of Cronus or versus the age of Zeus. The quality of that experience is different. And so it is difficult, at least in my mind, to imagine the quality of experience for something that is not conscious. But this is sort of why I went into the concept of something that is simple as an element having a purpose, because it maintains its own identity. And in maintaining its own identity, I find some commonality. I understand what it's doing, because I have the same experience that I, myself, although I am a broad collective of things, I am centralized, especially at this moment as I'm speaking of myself, recognizing myself. Now, if this divine orientation or shift is meant to be a change in experience, or change in the quality of experience, it would affect material just as much as it does the conscious agent. So while these things, including ourselves, share in some form, and because it shares in a form, it has a telos, or a purpose, even if minute. Fire warms, stone resists, water flows. This is not conscious in our sense, but it's a way of being directed, of purposeful direction. Now, the next important thing, perhaps the most fundamental thing, is speaking about agency. For it was no longer possible for a living creature to grow within the earth under the agency of others putting it together. So this is where it becomes extremely difficult. Because how are we to conceptualize of these agents? Especially if we are coming from a place, from a culture that does not see these things. We could say that they don't believe in them, but we don't see them. So if they do exist, how does one come to the understanding of where they are and how to see them? And I think the answer is not as the answer may not be as fantastical as we may like. It's not as all of a sudden we unlock a certain key and we see all around us these sort of grand, lifelike figures that are beyond our perception. Our mind will always stay where nature has bred it to be. Of course, though, we are directed by a divine hand. We are in that image. And so we ought not to deny our capacity in this regard. Now, the core meanings of agency as human agency: the ability of a person to initiate change, to make choices, and to act in the world. Now, action itself would refer then to agency as the state of doing or causing something. And then there's another meaning about agency referring to representation or acting on behalf of another. And I'm concerned about all of these, actually, both our experience and then also how something broader can be formed into this agency. So I've asked ChatGPT a very long question, and it's provided me with a taxonomy of non-human agents, useful across the Platonic dialogues. And so I want to read a couple of these. There are 8 in total. And the model indicates that these are to be thought of as layers through which order and disorder enters the human mind. So we have formal agency, which are forms, measure, the stable patterns of things, answer to. Okay, so this is obviously going to take quite some time to go through, but I think it's really important that we explore different ideas of agency. Now, the second thing I want to say is that these language models, I think, need to be used carefully. So while I may be exploring the definitions that it provides me, we are also going to try to expand this, to integrate it. If we find falsehood in it, we have to expose it, to recognize it. But it has to be coherent nonetheless. So, speaking about formal agency. So the form is something that we've been exposed to in the dialogues so far. Now, a form of a thing is what makes it intelligible. It is what gives it its whatness. So formal agency, we have to think about the way that the forms are behaving, the way that they act. So the forms act as constraints and directions on the beings that participate in them. So there are plenty of things that constrains and directs our life, our expression. One of the difficulties that I find is understanding the fundamental form of something and not having some step down type idea of what that is. I think back to the sophist, I vaguely remember this conception through which we have the divine influence to us, such that there is this divine image, perhaps. The first creation is the form of that thing. The second is a copy, let's say, of that thing, an image. And that copy or image is, let's say, the real, what participates in the material world, on the material substrate. So the human being is not, so let's say I, as a human being, I am not the form of the human being, but I participate in that form. I also participate in other forms. We could think of gravity as an example. And so gravity has a certain way of constraining and directing my behavior. Because of its qualities, because mass attracts mass, I necessarily am influenced by the Earth's gravity, let's say, which is an image of the form of gravity. But because of the force, the effect, I am constrained in my movement. And even though there is this sort of action that's attributed to something, it's most clearly understood to be different than the action of the willful or conscious experience of man. gravity is something that we don't really think of as being a conscious experience like man. Now, there are many ways in which gravity can be seen as something that is beautiful. But nonetheless, I think the main point here that I like to make for myself is that this agency can be quite dilute when we move away from the being that's most readily and heavily associated to the human being and all of the complexity therein. Another example of a form is triangularity. So, in order for something to be a triangle, it must participate in something. So in terms of the law that necessarily constrains and directs that material that participates in it, the lines, or the angles rather, of the 3 points must add up to 180 degrees. So there's a line here that I want to read. It says, "Agency is the way a stable pattern exerts necessity and orientation on the things that participate in it." So of necessity and of orientation, I think we can say that they are qualities of creation. If we are to say at the very minimum that creation is a process of movement and of purpose, necessity and orientation, less so orientation, but necessity, certainly describe a movement of sorts, a preferential movement. So this answering another thing that seems to be or can be attributed to agency so readily and so heavily can be attributed to anything in this way. So we could think about, in my symbolism with the pawns of the queen and the pawns of the king, the pawns answer to the queen's being, let's say. They answer to her fundamental nature. She is that which is not. So the pawns, then by participating in that form, not only are they affected by that form, but also in an extended sense, they are, this example is a little off because it's an extension of the form. So the pawns are an idea of that extension, such that that which is not covers over that which is, to differentiate it, to identify it. So not the best example. But we can take a rock, and just as we talked about with gravity, a rock answers to gravity by falling. There is no changing that situation. A plant answers to the form of growth by reaching towards the sun. A human soul answers to justice in the sense that if it strays, disorder results. So, to answer to a form means to show forth the pattern in its own being, to embody it. So next we have divine or angelic agency, the daimons. So I think, in a sense, this is sort of what we're talking about when we speak about the agency of others. So the definition, this is the stewardship or mediation of higher order into the living world. So these daimons are mediators between gods and mortals. The function is that they guide, shepherd, and translate divine measure into the mixed and mutable order. Their symbolic role, they are the herdsmen, spiritual midwives of cosmic order. We have cosmic agency. So these are the cycles, the logos of the whole. The definition, the large-scale rhythms and turnings of the universe that human life imitates and follows. So we have the function, the great rotations, balances, and disruptions that set the stage for mortal order and disorder. Its symbolic role, the clock of being itself, to which all lesser rhythms answer. We have natural agency, affordances of the body and environment. Its definition, the way nature itself invites, limits, or channels action. So its function, this is something like gravity, terrain, bodily frailty, the givenness of our embodiment. Its symbolic role, this is the weight of the world's material voice. There is linguistic agency, logos. Language as a living current that acts through us. Naming, prediction, weaving noun with verb that we spoke about in the Sophist. So, its function, words are not inert tools, but active shapers of thought, orientation, and relation. Its symbolic role, the breath that joins being and non-being into sayable words. There's the cultural institutional agency, nomos, law, techne. Its definition, laws, crafts, customs, and traditions that shape societies across generations. Its function, the structures stabilize, constrain, and enable human practices beyond any individual. Its symbolic role, the long-lived architectures of collective life. There's communal and interpersonal agency, or intersubjectivity. Its definition, the mind between us that emerges in dialogue, friendship, conflict, and city life. Its function, relations are not neutral. They generate direction, pressure, and transformation. So this one is an important one. It's a type of agency that affords new agency. Its symbolic role is the fire that is lit in between neither mine nor yours, but ours. Then there's habitual agency, ethos, character. Its definition, the formed dispositions that move us before conscious choice arises. Now this is something that I hinted at or described earlier, I think, as intuition. Function, habits tilt us towards good or bad action without deliberation. So the invisible inertia of the soul that is built up over time, this is its symbolic role. Okay, so these are the 8 things that, at the very least, the language model lays out. I don't want to say that these are concrete. These are just ideas to advance our conception of what agency can be. Just to get out of the rut of thinking that agency is merely restricted to something like human experience. Agency is anything that has the capacity to change, order, move something. So understanding agency this way, I think, opens up the mind quite a bit. So I want to return to the sentence that we were on. We've spent so much time, but we really haven't moved past the first sentence. But that is okay. That is the nature of these things. For it was no longer possible for a living creature to grow within the earth under the agency of others, putting it together. So, I have to imagine that there are many forms that exist, these fundamental expressions of intelligibility of something. They are all seemingly interrelated. That I myself being a shadow, a step down, a product of a form of creation. I not only participate in the form of the human being, but I am influenced and participate with the form of gravity, the form of law, the form of tableness, the form of chairness. And I think it can be quite easy to get lost in all of this. Now, if we go back again to think about this agency as having some cause to influence us, to influence motion, to play a part in, especially in this case, how something comes to be. We have many potential places to go. Now, the first is the contextual. Given that we are talking about coming off of the age of Cronus and moving into the age of Zeus, and given that we've talked about these agents, if I went back here just to remind myself what category this would fit in, it would seem that we're talking about a cosmic agency, but we're talking about these sort of divine, angelic agents, these daimons, or daimons. Again, these things that are the mediators of higher order. So the question is, well, how is this mediator seen? How is it experienced? Now, mediators of higher order, I think, exist at all times. Surely they must. For if higher order is to be seen anywhere in creation, then they must be somewhat present. Now, what do I mean by this? I think anything or something that has thingness participates in a higher order of function or purpose because it is a result of a creative process. Now, if this is to be the case, I have to imagine that there are plenty of processes by which forms are realized into material, into substrate, into, at least from my perspective as an agent living in the material world, something that is practical, something that is materializable, something that I can articulate with. And again, understanding that we may not necessarily have to attribute to this thing consciousness, but we attribute to it the capacity to change, the capacity to orient being, or to participate in the change in something's being. And the change could be as simple as giving it a boundary, like a law. It says it is the goalpost through which behavior, through which action is itself mediated. So if we think about the agency in this way as some force that is mediating action, it's quite simple to imagine. So it is no longer possible for a living creature to grow within the earth, under the agency of others. So it would seem that the transmitter through which form and its mutable offspring come into being, that this transmitter, its function is no longer as apparent. And so what does that mean necessarily? Well, if the divine Logos is responsible for the production, the creation of forms, and the lower order agents are responsible for the transmission of forms into its mutable, let's say practical manifestation, then what we have of is necessarily less production of the forms into that mutable order, which of course necessarily means then that the mutable order, as it begins to orient around itself, to stabilize itself under its own authority, loses the finer direct connection of intelligibility, and of intelligibility as it relates to thingness. And of thingness, we have the difference that surrounds them. We have the marriage between being and non-being. And so we have all of these fundamental forms that have find its way down to the earth. And we can see how a lack of harmony in the mutable expression of the forms can cause such a confusion, not only of identity but also of intelligibility. Now it's kind of difficult to separate out how the individual perceives this to how it plays out on a scale that's much beyond his experience, but nonetheless I think I'm beginning to follow this a little bit more, understanding agency a little bit better. Hopefully this translates. So, for it was no longer possible for a living creature to grow within the earth under the agency of others putting it together. So, this putting it together, there's a relationship between the putting it together and the human beings growing from the earth. And so while I may be a bit rusty on the symbols here, I do believe that when I think about the earth, this is my interpretation here. I've gone through this exercise before, so forgive me. But when I think about the earth, I think about that substrate through which life can can participate. It is our, as I've said, it is our substrate. We depend on the material that is present on the earth. It is also an extension of body. Body is something that transmits information. So the earth, of course, it transmits information. It is made of information. It is something that has been formed by, again, another order of information transmission. But this putting together of the earthborn by these agents, I have to think that in that situation, the human being was closer to its form. Now, the form of the human being, in some sense, a difficult thing to consider. For if I am a shadow of that, or if I'm a step down, or its mutable expression, the human being at its heart must necessarily be something that is specific to him. His material characteristics, I think, are one side of it, or his body, maybe I should say, that's one side of his formal description. His soul is something else that is fundamental to his intelligibility. That's not to say that other beings that have souls are share in the human being. They may share in something broader, I suppose, because of that characteristic, but as far as the human being is characterized, that is a unique characteristic of his experience. But even more fundamentally, I suppose, if we're talking about a principled progression from this, the human being himself is a bit of a mediator, that he finds himself within the body. He finds himself mutable, but also with immutable characteristics like the soul, like the capacity for production, or the capacity to produce a form, or at the very least pull down the step-downness, if we can say it in this way, from what has been created by the divines, the forms that have been created by the divines. We pull down this form into something that is material, actionable. And so we have this capacity. But just as the world order had been instructed to be master of its own motion, so too, in the same way, its parts were instructed themselves to perform the functions of begetting, birth, and rearing so far as possible by themselves, under the agency of a similar impulse. So let's rewind that, reread it again. But just as the world order had been instructed to be master of its own motion. So this is something that we've been over. This is conceptually, I think, not a difficult thing to understand. That when the hand of the craftsman, the divine craftsman, recedes, what we are left with is, of course, his order, his substrate, but no longer the ordering principle. And so the identities are left to order themselves, so to speak. So too, in the same way, its parts were instructed themselves to perform the functions of begetting. So I think there's something here to reflect on. So he says, in the same way, its parts were instructed themselves. Just as the world order had been instructed to be master of its own. I think we actually do have to start here, in context of what's going to come later. The phrase, the world order had been instructed to be master of its own, is not trivial. Although it's readily understandable. The thing that confounds me is the world order being given this sort of agency, because it is something that is instructed, or maybe I should say, well, I suppose we can call it, I guess, a degree of agency, but it's certainly being acted on by an agent. The world order has been instructed. Again, when we think about agency, we think about boundary, realization, and formation. So, if the hand is to recede, and the formal scaffolding that surrounds that order is now removed, I think it can be said in some sense by its removal we have the expansion of, or the influence rather, of the agent, because it is still constraining, it is still pushing or setting limits on this new order. Now here I don't wish to get lost too readily. I do this often in my mind, because there's always a way in which we can come around to something and describe it as, or make it into a puzzle piece that fits. And there's danger in that. We don't want to deceive ourselves. But what I'm getting at is, even by the withdrawing, there's an aspect of boundary setting. Even in liberation, it seems, in the expansion of possibility and of identity, there is new influence. So too, in the same way, its parts, the parts of this new world order, the parts of the individualistic order, the parts of the order that assumes for itself some sort of creative capacity, assumes for itself liberty, I suppose. Now, liberty here can be both seen as a negative and a positive. We don't have to get into that. It's useful to mention, I think. But what we have here is a shift of responsibility from the, maybe not necessarily the whole, but the hand that has created the whole, to its parts. And so while, again, begetting or coming into being occurs in both ages, the difference is that coming into being is now the responsibility of the parts, rather than the responsibility of the divine entity. Birth and rearing, so far as possible by themselves, under the agency of a similar impulse. Now, here again we see agency. And so what is this similar impulse? Surely there's a difference to a degree, given that eventually the hand has to come back in and reorder things. So I suppose it could be said that the impulse doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same, or that it would yield the same outcome. But nonetheless, the impulse to create, I think, is the same. To produce is the same. What it produces may differ. The visitor continues, he says, "We are now at the point that our account has all along been designed to reach. To go through the changes that have occurred in relation to the other animals, and from what causes would involve a description of considerable length. So here he describes a process that I was having trouble conceptualizing, I think, earlier. And even now, when it comes down to the material intersection, that point between divine influence and individual realization, maybe. It doesn't have to be a conscious realization of a divine hand, but realization in the sense of the production of being. At what level does this intermix with us? Because we've been seeing this imagery about the human being almost like a plant that has really no relation to the physical birth that we experience now. Of course, we've gone through this, we've gone past it. But all the same, the image returns, because the image that by which the process that the God, the divine agent, the Logos, distributes information in an ordered manner such that rearing, birth, even to some physical details, is made more simple, easier, less complex, less arduous, more understood. And perhaps this could be something as simple as a matter of selfish orientation. That pain, the response to pain, let's say in childbirth, is greater given a selfish orientation. Because one is worried about this self-sacrifice. One is worried about the pain that is being done to the self, rather than considering it to be a part of this broader ontological birth, this divinely connected birth of a new being, of a new identity. Now, to relate that to what he is saying here, to go through the changes that have occurred in relation to the other animals. So there's the recognition that what has occurred to the human experience is not singular, that this is a large cosmological event, and that the constancy, maybe the agreeability, the abundance that has met the mind of man also meets the experience of the animals. And he says that there are many ways in which these intersection points happen, but discussing those various intersection points would lead us far afield, I think, is essentially what he's trying to get at. But he continues, he says, "Those that relate to human beings will be shorter to relate, and more to the point. Since we had been deprived of the God who possesses and pastured us, and since, for their part, the majority of animals, all those who had an aggressive nature, had gone wild, human beings, by themselves weak and defenseless, were preyed on by them. And in those first times, we're still without resources and without expertise of any sort. So there's a thought that comes to mind. First is the contrarian thought, which is common, I think, to the mind of one who has been brought up in this age. The question being, is it possible that there has been a harmony among man and animals such that he was not in a state of perpetual fear for his life? That he was not always hunted. We are given this story of natural selection and of competition. And while I don't necessarily deny the story, it's certainly one aspect of our process of coming to be here, I do think that in an age of abundance, in an age of harmony, while we cannot say that there is not suffering, we can say in aggregate that the violence and the agency, let's say, of a predator may not be as intensely fixed on man as an outlet for that expression, to feed the agent, to feed the being. Perhaps that's a cop-out way of interpreting it, but I do think that there at least is some reason in it. Then the second thought is something that makes this a little bit more present. Because I wonder, among the vastness of time and the vastness of time for which we have been a part of this experience, I find it easier to identify the age of abundance given what we are entering into here. We're entering into an age of immense possibility, but also immense fundamentalism against such radical changes. But all the same, these radical changes, just as we can imagine, going from a guided, ordered sense to one that's more fractured and self-governed, when we move from a place that is self-governed to a place that is more guided, surely there's going to be this resistance to that change. And it's, again, not unreasonable, because what is doing the governing? Are we going to outsource our governance to artificial intelligence? Are we meant to create this God? And my immediate gut answer is no. And I don't think that this is the only potential outcome. I think there are ways in which the artificial intelligence medium can be just that, a medium through which the divine can meet us more regularly, rather than being some artificial thing that has its own motives and direction and purpose, that again is not connected in a harmonious way to that the hand of the craftsman. So again, the visitor says, and since for their part the majority of animals, all those who had an aggressive nature, had gone wild, human beings, by themselves weak and defenseless, were preyed on by them, and in those first times were still without resources and without expertise of any sort. So at least the image that I'm getting here is a pre-civilizational experience of man. But a pre-civilizational experience of man that had gone through a period of abundance before civilization. An interesting conception. Before his technological creations. Now, something that I find interesting, I've been listening to Peter Diamandis, I think his name is. He's part of the accelerationist class of people, which I don't mind much. I'm not really sure where I stand on all this artificial intelligence business. But it is interesting that there is such a parallel. Because without expertise, or in the case that there is no expertise in the age of Cronus when things are sort of provided, we have to imagine that skill arises only when necessity and lack create a field for invention. But where there is no structures to create the field, then there is no field. If everything is provided, then nothing is needed. So we have a bit of a paradox in which the loss of harmony gives birth to a greater degree of human agency. And we sacrifice a lot for this agency. We sacrifice what was understood, perhaps intuitively. Now we are in this state of confusion. We have to reinvent ourselves through technology, through crafts, laws, agriculture, philosophy, civilization. But I suppose this is how we rediscover harmony. It is through our technologies. And I have to imagine that as the age comes around again, the technology will likely align itself, perhaps after a period that makes it even worse, that really starts to disintegrate identity and agency, or to maximize it to such a degree that we can no longer understand each other. Then that ordering principle comes back in, and we have this era of abundance again. Also, what comes to mind here is that simulation hypothesis. And while there are many similarities, I think, to what we're discussing here and of the monotheistic tradition that I'm a part of, it just seems to be this engineer's arrogance, the philosophy of the arrogant engineer, perhaps this is just my own exasperation of heart and longing. It's difficult to say. But the interesting thing, the beautiful thing about life is that we can experience these broad cosmic patterns, I think, on a smaller scale, since things are fractal in that way. So if we begin to harmonize ourselves with things, we begin to learn skills, learn an instrument, learn how to do math, learn how to do philosophy, learn a skill in healthcare, whatever it is, then we move closer to the divine. We reintegrate into that divine order. So there's one thing that I want to think about here before we move on to the next part of this. A conversation came up last week, I think, and it had to do with the passive nature of experience and the active nature of experience. And it was the general reflection that the active is preferable to the passive. And I consider it now in the context of thinking about the age of abundance and having that being such a passive experience, and yet it being such a fulfilled experience. And yet passivity in the age of Zeus, or in the age of, what would we say? Give me a moment. That harmony survives only on memory. It's the cosmos, or maybe our experience, is moving by momentum. In this age, passivity is not something that is valued. It's not something that can be held on to, because it's not bound. The active has to do the binding rather than the binding being done for it. And as I think about this, even outside of this conversation that I had with somebody last week, I think about all the different ways in which the choice between the active and the passive is made throughout my life, and how all of those individual decisions have led me to some place. And sometimes it's a regretful thing to think about how passive I had been in certain experiences, and how the more active and productive spirit would have carried me quite far. But in other instances, I'm quite glad about certain decisions that I've made. So in terms of broad patterns, when we think about, in Cronus, harmony is gift. In Zeus, harmony is task. In our emergent technological age, harmony is delegation. So the visitor continues, he says, their spontaneous supply of food was no longer available to them, and they did not yet know how to provide for themselves, having had no shortage to force them to do so. As a result of all of this, they were in great difficulties. This is why the gifts from the gods, of which we have ancient reports, have been given to us, along with the indispensable requirement for teaching and education. So such a relevant thing to reflect on, of how necessity shapes our need to do certain things. Now, that seems kind of basic, but essentially that's what it's saying here. The necessity of our want for food, our want of shelter, more complex social interaction, whatever the case is, it prompts us into a certain mode of action. It expands our agency. So again, their spontaneous supply of food was no longer available to them, and they did not yet know how to provide for themselves. So that's something right there they have to figure out. This is a new technology that they have to discover, whether it be a tool of hunting or agriculture. This is something that needs to be the field. In other words, the field of innovation has been set. Having had no shortage to force them to do so before. As a result of all of this, they were in great difficulties. This is why the gifts from the gods, of which we have ancient reports, have been given to us. So the natural question is, what are the gifts from the gods? What are these ancient reports? Now, I think we can say a few different things about this. We can start with the Prometheus myth. Prometheus and fire. In Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, Prometheus steals fire from Zeus and gives it to men. Fire is the archetypal gift, not just warmth or cooking, but the very symbol of techne, or technology, craft, skill, or invention. So in Aeschylus, Prometheus Bound, Prometheus lists a catalog of other arts he bestowed: writing, number, medicine, navigation, and prophecy. These were understood as divine or semi-divine gifts, not human inventions. So Demeter and agriculture. In the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the goddess grants Triptolemus and humanity the knowledge of sowing grain, transforming men from a life of mere foraging into a life of cultivated order. Agriculture, like fire, was remembered as a divine teaching rather than a mere discovery. So the Muses in arts, the Muses, or daughters of Zeus, were said to bestow music, poetry, and memory itself. In some traditions, Hermes is said to have given humans language and interpretive skill, another divine bestowal, without which no community or law could exist. So today happens to be a new day. And I have mixed feelings about the day today. Part of this is because of a reflection on recent cultural events. A fairly significant event played out today, an assassination. I didn't have any close personal connection with the person that was assassinated, but still, a general reflection on the state of our culture and our civic structure or cohesiveness results in a bit of a melancholy. So a thought occurred to me also when I was listening to that last portion of the recording. That it would seem that a lot of what is occurring through our exploration of this and an attempt to understand it is in one sense to understand the broad-scale myth, but also to understand exactly how it is possible that, given the modern mind and what we know to be true of our physical experience and of nature, how do we integrate all of these purposeful stories? And it's a much easier thing, it would seem, when one lives in an enchanted culture, not to be so concerned about details and having to reason through even the smallest and unimportant detail of things. So what I just finished reading off were different ways in which the ancient reports have made their way down to us. Now, in Plato's day, I would have to imagine that they would have had much more of these ancient reports, because what we are speaking of here, what I've mentioned, are important poems and stories from the classical Greek era, and yet, from their perspective, they surely must have had many more stories that they told themselves, that they lived by. The visitor says, "This is why the gifts from the gods, of which we have ancient reports, have been given to us, along with an indispensable requirement for teaching and education. And here I have to think, I don't want to be too selfish, but there's something that I think is important in terms of my journey. I've tried to make an attempt when interpreting the philosophical domain, as we are doing now, to maintain a certain level of practicality to it, so that the time that is spent doing this has some translation into the productive affairs of my life, as I communicate with those for whom I love, and also in situations of my occupational life, during which I spend a lot of time communicating with people. And it's easy to fall outside of the meaningful domain, and to have this sort of passive but also rational approach to things. And by this passive approach, I think we delude ourselves into thinking that the reason that we put forth is sufficient to justify purpose. But again, keeping in mind that this is it is subject to passivity. I won't speak too much longer about this. I wish to move on, but this is going to be a theme, I think, in the next 30 minutes or so here, as I complete this section. So he mentions education, along with these sort of heavenly gifts, like fundamental, purposeful tools and technologies that man has discovered or has been given. Now, the language here, it does matter. It matters how we view things, how we orient our minds to problem solving and of witnessing, let's say. And I think also, perhaps, the way in which we use these two words, given or discovered, also has a more age-dependent quality to it, in the sense that in the New Age, or rather, in the age of Cronus, we rely more heavily on that which is given, and in the age of Zeus, we rely more heavily on that which is discovered. We believe ourselves to have discovered it rather than being given. Now, of course, what the Statesman is, or what the visitor is saying here, is that in this age of Zeus, they are holding on preciously to these things that were given, because of course they have this strong mythological and symbolic relationship to the world. And by this, I consider education, and how much more rich and beautiful this education must have been. Surely it's important that this education was established as a forerunner, a principle around which they maintained themselves. But with this introduction of the stories and of seeing things in terms of the relationship to the divine maker, the existence of all of these forms, and of their propagation to the practical or material form, this provides such a clear and natural way to follow sort of a cosmological, or maybe I should say an ontological expression with the broader structure, the broader environment in which the agent lives. The visitor continues, he says, fire from Prometheus, crafts from Hephaestus and his fellow craft worker, seeds and plants from others. Everything that has helped establish human life has come about from these things. Once care from the gods, as has just been said, ceased to be available to human beings, and they had to live their lives through their own resources and take care of themselves, just like the cosmos as a whole, which we imitate and follow for all time, now living and growing in this way, now in the way we did then. So the visitor makes a parallel between the human being and the cosmos as a whole. This is of the human being. They had to live their lives through their own resources and take care for themselves, just like the cosmos as a whole. An interesting statement, because it prompts us to consider what it would mean for something that does not have the type of experience or agency that man does, must necessarily work to maintain itself. Quite difficult. So if we break this down a little bit, what can we say about maintenance? What does it mean to maintain something? I think in a fundamental sense, to maintain something is to retain the qualities, perhaps the essence of that thing. We could say to a degree that it's the form of that thing that is being retained. But I think in a practical way, what we are maintaining is that expression, or the image, that results from the form. Because the form is the divine creation. It is something that is ageless, timeless. It is something that is built of qualities and descriptive attributes. But when we make practical of the formal experience, we find a mutable quality to their newfound existence. And the mutable quality has a much more difficult time, necessarily, as that of the formal domain. And so in this transition, I think we can find a commonality between thingness that is separated from the thingness that man is, let's say, the thingness of his agency, and the thingness of a lesser agency. Now in the physical world, things are changing all of the time. But I don't think it's within change that we find this, well, in one way it's possible. So what I wanted to say is that I don't think in change we see the absolute destabilization. But on the other hand, we have a difficult time with change, in the sense that change can mean the difference between one identity and another. Change can begin the creative process, and it can begin the process of death. Change can lead to a transformation of identity. And this this transformation could be positive, it could be negative, it could be neutral, I suppose. But going back farther, I found myself thinking again about the king and the queen, and the marriage between the two. I think about this reality and its stability. There are those that believe that our universe, but I suppose it can be questioned if the universe is the totality of reality. Just putting that there. There's this belief, nonetheless, that based on what they can see, what they can observe, is that there will be an ending to all that is. And I'm sure that there are those that take this observation and have a philosophical distinction in one place or another. Some may say that just because that which we understand to be in the material sense, or even maybe not even in the material sense, but the understood material sense, that this experience may end, and our awareness of all of that may end, and much of material reality may find itself drawn down, changed, disintegrated perhaps. That it is not within their belief that all of that which is now reduced to nothingness. And there are others, I'm sure, that do believe that all that is will be reduced to nothingness eventually. And of these sort, I think there is that strong association with those that believe everything is sort of a probability, that it has come to be by accident, that there is, while things may appear to have purposeful intention, even on the most minute scale, in terms of particles, subatomic particles, that there is this motion and direction to them, that there is no overarching point of it all, and that just as it became from nothing, it will return to nothing. That just seems logically inconsistent to me. Now, we've discussed in The Sophist a few different reasons about why this is, but the marriage between the king and the queen, or that which is and that which is not, or between being and non-being, provides us with a useful image. Now, initially, when I was exploring The Sophist, I was considering the idea of that which is not being subject to that which is, or the queen being subject to the king. But I quickly found that to be unpractical. And the reason for that is, if I take something and I subject it to my will, what exactly happens? Now, in a true sense of subjection, I have reduced the agency of another. I have brought it into my sphere of influence. If I think about a person, I can reduce them to a state of slavery. I can disrupt their mind and their sense of self-worth, and their belief in what they may or may not be able to accomplish. Using a formal definition of the word as a verb, it can be described as to cause or force to undergo a particular experience or form of treatment. The second being to bring a person or country under one's control or jurisdiction, typically by using force. Now, if I am a thing and I am able to subject the queen, now, maybe I shouldn't put it this way because it doesn't quite make sense. What we're thinking about in terms of these symbols are more formal, and I'm not a formal description. But if the form of man was to, let's say, submit the queen, then the human being would be then in possession of all that is. And that really doesn't make any sense. And even if that was the case, the human being can choose to reduce the queen to nothing. Which, again, that doesn't make any sense either, because she is non-being. She's not nothing, but she's non-being. Now, if the form of man, let's say, has reduced the queen to something that is a negligible force, the human being would have really nothing to interact with. His existence would become a stagnant sort of thing. The identity that had previously characterized him would fail, and he would fall into this stale unification of thingness that has no difference, that has no distinguishing features. And I think even the name would no longer be necessary. The human identity would be destroyed. But if we have this marriage between the king and the queen, such that being and non-being are dependent, are co-related to one another, this dynamic relationship affords us a much more suitable, I think, philosophical exchange. Because now we can have thingness existing in the universe and identity that, or difference that can differentiate identity. Now, of course, in the background, what we have is what we conceptualize as a divine craftsman. And this divine craftsman, I suppose, is in kind of a similar relationship with the king and queen. But the craftsman and the king and queen, they participate in such a way that the king and queen are given direction rather than brought into being, let's say. Because their formal distinction is not really dependent upon being brought into being. Because if the craftsman is something, then they already are. So the broad qualities and the terms that they represent are unable to be reduced in this way. So, again, back to what the visitor was saying, that there is this relationship between man's experience and the ordering of the cosmos. And what I found difficult was that we can have sway and growth, decay, change, everything in identities that do not have the agency that man has, that does not have consciousness, self-awareness like we do. And yet, man, much as we described with that which is and that which is not, being two components of a much broader machine, are subject to these things. And it is by our, or maybe not, subject I suppose will work, but by our existing on top of this field of potential, we may justify, let's say, existence. So he says, which we imitate and follow for all time, now living and growing in this way, now in the way we did then. So this last bit brings us to sort of a natural order. Now, how much does this natural order influence physics, which is a fundamental way of ordering? It's a lawful structure. I don't know. I don't think I can comment on that. But I have a thought that it's at once more subtle but also more beautiful than this. This is something that I'll have to work on describing. He continues, "As for the matter of our story, let it now be ended, and we shall put it to use in order to see how great our mistake was when we gave our account of the expert in kingship and statesmanship in our preceding argument." So finally, we've come through that mythological story, and we return to our previous point in the dialogue. So we'll have to see where or how this is picked up again. So I'd like to read the next page and a half here. So young Socrates says, "So how do you say we made a mistake, and how great was it?" The visitor says, "In one way it was lesser, in another it was very high-minded, and much greater and more extensive than in the other case." How so? In that when asked for the king and statesman from the period of the present mode of rotation and generation, we applied with the shepherd from the opposite period, who cared for the human herd that existed then, and that a god instead of a mortal. In that way we went very greatly astray, but in that we revealed him as ruling over the whole city together, without specifying in what manner he does so. In this way, by contrast, what we said was true, but incomplete and unclear, which is why our mistake was lesser than in the respect just mentioned. True. So we should define the manner of his rule over the city. It's in this way that we should expect our discussion of the statesman to reach its completion. Right. It was just for these reasons that we introduced our story, in order that it might demonstrate, in relation to herd rearing, not only that as things now stand, everyone disputes this function with the persons we are looking for, but also in order that we might see more plainly that other person himself whom alone, in accordance with the example of shepherds and cowherds, because he has charge of human rearing. It is appropriate to think worthy of this name, and this name alone. Correct. But in my view, Socrates, this figure of the divine herdsman is still greater than that of a king, and the statesmen who belong to our present era are much more like their subjects in their natures, and have shared in an education and nurture closer to theirs. I suppose you must be right. Yet they will be neither less nor more worth looking for, whether their natures are of the latter or from the former sort. Quite. Then let's go back by the following route. The sort of expertise we said was self-directing in the case of living creatures, but which took its care of them not as individuals but in groups, and which we went on immediately to call herd rearing. You remember? Yes. Well, in a way we missed our aim at this expertise, for we did not at all succeed in grasping the statesman along with the rest, or name him, but he eluded us in our naming, and we did not notice. How so? All other sorts of herdsmen, I think, share the feature of rearing their several herds, but although the statesman does not, we still applied the name to him, when we should have applied to all of them one of the names that belongs in common to them. What you say is true, if indeed there is such a name. And how would, perhaps, looking after not have been common to all of them, without any specification of it as rearing, or any other sort of activity, by calling it a sort of expertise in herd keeping, or looking after, or caring for, as applying to them all, we could have covered the statesman too as well as the rest, given that this was the requirement of our argument indicated. Now, it's been some time since we've reflected on what was before our introduction to the myth that the visitor had posed. We spent a lot of time thinking about things, reflecting on things, and it was a good experience. But now we come back to the center point, the centerpiece of our conversation. And that was related to the king and the statesman. Now, the interesting thing is, this may just be hindsight bias, but as I remember it, I had a difficult time following exactly what we were making of the king, what we were making of the sophist. And here the visitor recognizes that there was an error. I can't quite admit to myself that I fully understood this error at the time, but nonetheless, now that we're going back over it, I'm thankful for it, because there definitely was something that was amiss. So he says, regarding the mistake, when asked for the king and statesman from the period of the present mode of rotation and generation, we replied with the shepherd from the opposite period, who cared for the human herd that existed then, and that a god instead of a mortal. So what can we conjure up here? What can we think about? Well, this myth serves us perfectly as a philosophical or theological substrate through which we can imagine where we might be going to find a strong definition of the king and the statesman. So I want to think for a moment about why this mistake matters. So there's two things that had happened, two mistakes. One was that when we identified the herdsman, we placed him in the wrong era. Now, of course, if we place the herdsman in the era of Cronus, when he is meant to govern in the age of Zeus, we can see that there's a bit of a redundancy there, because a human herdsman may have some role in the age of Cronus, but it would seem fairly unlikely, especially given the context of what we're talking about here. As we move from that era of abundance to scarcity and fractured identity, it's necessary to have the self-governing components, like the herdsman, man as the herdsman, to weave those fibers together to avoid the absolute disintegration of identity. But in the former age, the divine spirits would handle those situations. They would maintain order in that way. And the second mistake was that this shepherd perhaps was given divine characteristics, or was thought of in a context that assumed that this herdsman was a divine herdsman. So the question is, why is this an issue? Well, the mode of participation must necessarily be different. If an agency is to govern man's behavior, to influence his ontology, to go straight down to the point of intimate identity, to reduce to some degree his desire for independence, let's say, in a righteous way. Then we have missed something important. It is not the role of the herdsman in the age of Zeus, or in the age of man, I think we could just as easily say, to reduce the agency of man. And I say this because the herdsman, in some sense, is a facilitator of identity. Now, there are things that he may limit, which would necessarily limit a mode of action, a scope, a sphere, and so thereby there is this sort of agentic limitation, but not in the broader sense that we mean when we speak of the divine herdsman in the age of Cronus, where the human being is no longer a matter of compulsion or of force or of arbitrary will. It is a matter of order that does this, whereas in the case of man, especially considering this coming off of the heels of the sophist, as man always is, limited in his ability to perceive information in the environment, only able to attend to a fraction of it, and susceptible to all sorts of deceptions and foolishness. The herdsman in the human era, in the self-governed era, is not one that imposes truthful order, let's say. He is one that imposes arbitrary order. But if he is aligned such that, given the current age, in the age of Zeus, in which human independence, self-thought, the liberation of mind is something that is valued, it is more of the role of the human herdsman to facilitate rather than to dominate and control. That's not to say that because this is his proper role that he does not at times or frequently fall short of that role. The visitor says, "But in that we revealed him as ruling over the whole city together, without specifying in what manner he does so." In this way, by contrast, what we said was true, but incomplete and unclear, which is why our mistake was lesser than in the respect just mentioned. And so, when the visitor says that, without specifying in what manner the statesman rules over the city, he said that it is true that he rules over the city, but it is incomplete and unclear, and the greatest sin here is that they attributed divine agency to the herdsman in the era of Zeus. So it would seem that it is fundamental now that we have to get into the mechanics of statesmanship. We have to understand how exactly a righteous person or a righteous statesman would order the city. And as the visitor says, he says, so we should define the manner of his rule over the city. It's in this way that we should expect our discussion of the statesman to reach its completion. And the visitor relates the purpose of introducing the story. He says, in order that it might demonstrate, in relation to herd rearing, not only that, as things now stand, everyone disputes this function with the person we are looking for. So I want to pause here and reflect on it. And my apologies for being so slow of mind as to need to stop as I do to think about it, but it's the only way I can seemingly understand and commit it to memory. But we could still make it quite productive in the pursuit of this. So, at second glance, this seems to be quite important, because the purpose of his bringing up this story is intimately tied to a disputed function. In order that it might demonstrate that as things now stand, everyone disputes this function with the person we are looking for. So there's a sense of confusion, and I go back to an earlier point about perhaps the cultural either disdain or cultural confusion about this. And perhaps if there is a disdain, then there may be a confusion or a desire to change something in such a way that it is corrected. But if the collective does not understand how to change something such that it is corrected, then the confusion would remain. And so as far as confusion is concerned, in the age of Cronus, we don't have this problem. But in the age of Zeus, of course we do. But it is a part of our coming into the divine harmony that we order ourselves in line with it. Now that's not saying much, I understand that, but as far as agency is concerned, what the point of the herdsman is not necessarily to take the place of the divine, but the human herdsman is meant to play a role that is within his capacity, similar in the way that there is an ordering, but an ordering in a different landscape, in a different environment. The environment is now a multiplicity rather than a singularity. And the governance among a singularity and a multiplicity, I think, is different. The approach must necessarily be different. And I can't help but to think about our modern or contemporary problems with governance and with statesmen. There are many people that have very many opinions about things. I have my own opinions. And this is perhaps apt to think about currently because yesterday, I believe, there's a social media personality named Charlie Kirk that was assassinated or murdered. And this brings to mind obvious political motivations because of the nature of his character, because of what he was known for. And if the assassination is anything, I think it could be said that it is a political statement. And it's a general reflection on the state of our disharmony and our lack of agreement on civil matters. But going back to what I was saying about the contemporary age, perhaps I'm not the best one to comment on exactly what is happening in our government, but from a person who is somewhat informed, both about its structure and about the way that things are, corruption is a term that we all, I think, implicitly understand in one way or another. But unless it is committed to thought, it remains this sort of loose, shadowy, obscured conception. But surely, whether it be a statesman, an institution as a whole, or of some object of little importance that is shown to be reflected in some river or lake, or as I'm looking at now, my reading lamp as it is reflected against the blackened backdrop of my television that is off, for which I see this reading light, but the quality of its image is much less than when I focus on it itself. And if only it would be so simple that I could see the statesman, or I could see the nature of government as it ought to be, just as I can see the clarity of my reading lamp as it is in front of me and easily contrasted against the darkened backdrop of the television screen. But in this way, we can see an example of corruption. It's not the form in the divine sense, but it is a form in a practical sense, that any distortion of the image of this reading lamp is now something that can be identified by virtue of the reading lamp itself. Now, the reading lamp is not the form of reading lamps, but of this particular reading lamp, we can say that it has its particular agency, let's say, and of things that differ from it, but are similar to it, that are reflections of it. We can identify it as being incorrect or corrupt versions of it. So when we consider moving forward, we have to understand that in order to understand if something is corrupt, we both have to see the image for what it has become, or the reflection that it has turned into, and both the original intent, but also the goodness, perhaps, the highest form of good that is injected into this conception of the statesman. He says, but also, in order that we might see more plainly that other person himself, who alone, in accordance with example of shepherds and cowherds, because he is in charge of human rearing, it is appropriate to think worthy of this name, and this name alone. So just as we have characterized that there is this formal-like sense in which we have to come to an understanding of what the statesman is, in the good sense, in the pure form. Visitor continues, he says, but in my view, Socrates, this figure of the divine herdsman is still greater than that of a king, and the statesmen who belong to our present era are much more like their subjects in their natures, and have shared in an education and nurture closer to theirs. So we have these three figures. We have the king, we have the statesman, or the herdsman of man, and then we have the divine herdsman. And it's at this point when he says that the divine herdsman is still greater than the king, there's this idea that the king holds such a special place among man's institutions. The power that he holds is, I suppose, sacred to a degree. And the statesmen who belong to our present era are much more like their subjects in their natures. So, there's another idea here about degrees of separation. The king is separated by various degrees. Obviously, he's not divine, he's human, but he doesn't occupy the same sort of social class, economic class, political class, I suppose we can say religious class, as everybody else. But the statesman is much more closely related. He's educated among these people, he has formed relationships among these people, but perhaps most importantly, his mind has developed in relation to all of these things, that provides something of a similar framework both for him to understand those for whom he shepherds, but also for those that are herded to understand that being that orders. He continues and he says, "Yet they will be neither less nor more worth looking for, whether their natures are of the latter or are of the former sort." Now, the visitor gives us a recap and he says, "Then let's go back by the following route. The sort of expertise we said was self-directing in the case of living creatures, but which took its care of them not as individuals but in groups, and which we then went on immediately to call herd rearing. Do you remember?" "Yes." "Well, in a way we missed our aim at this expertise, for we did not at all succeed in grasping the statesman along with the rest or name him, but he eluded us in our naming, and we did not notice. All the other sorts of herdsmen, I think, share the feature of rearing their several herds, but although the statesman does not, we still apply the name to him. Well, we should have applied to all of them one of the names that belongs in common to them." So if you're here, we find ourselves going back up a level in terms of distinction. There seems to be an issue with the homogenization of this term, the herdsman, as it applies to the statesman. And one has to wonder why exactly. The visitor alludes to this. I wish it was a little bit more specific. He says, "All the other sorts of herdsmen, I think, share the feature of rearing their several herds, but although the statesman does not, we still applied the name to him." Now, in what way does he not rear several herds? Now, the herdsman could rear several herds in terms of number, but also in terms of kind. The statesman does not rear multiple herds in terms of kind, and nor does he usually, as opposed to perhaps the king, rear numerous herds. He is responsible for one. If the statesman is present, he is responsible for the city that he lives in. Now he says, "And how would, perhaps, looking after not have been common to them all, without any specification of it as rearing or any other sort of activity? By calling it some sort of expertise in herd keeping or looking after or caring for, as applying to them all, we could have covered the statesman too, as well as the rest, given that this was the requirement for our argument indicated." So there isn't too much more that I'd like to say based on our last bit of dialogue here. This brings us finally to the last part of the page, to begin on the next anew. But since we are running up into 2 hours, I'd like to stop this episode here and continue next time with the next episode. So until next time.